Thank you, everybody, for being here today. We believe that by teaching students how to distinguish between credible information sources, along with mis and disinformation, and how to avoid that erroneous information or correct it quickly is really important. And this will help them be a valuable asset to their online network. And we believe that as faculty and staff, part of our job is to help students learn how to navigate today's media ecosystem and the post-truth environment.
So first, I'd like to take just a minute to preview what we're going to discuss today so you can follow along. We're going to talk about the importance of the topic of media literacy and the goals of our workshop. We'll define a few key terms. And last, we'll have 3 tools people can use to navigate today's digital world. The first strategy we'll discuss is counterfactual evaluation, then the SIFT method, and finally, debunking misinformation.
All right, so let's dive into the goals of our session today. By the end of today's presentation, participants will understand how to teach students some really powerful media literacy strategies, including counterfactual evaluation, SIFT, and debunking. And these are really crucial tools that equip students to not only recognize misinformation, but also effectively respond to it. Also, participants will gain new ideas for hands-on approaches for teaching students how to identify and respond to mis and disinformation. And I would really like to mention that we have curated some helpful tools and resources in addition to our references, and they're available through the QR code, and I also posted the link in the chat.
So we want to start the presentation by just making sure everybody's on the same page with a couple key terms. The first key term is misinformation, and we're defining that as false information that is spread by mistake, or there could be an intent to mislead. Disinformation is information that is deliberately disseminated to mislead, and fake news is false information that tends to be sensational in nature, and that's going to mimic the views of media content. So Lewandowski proposes a debunking strategy, which I'll talk about later in the presentation, but we wanted to first introduce you to this idea of responding to misinformation. So here are some strategies, here is an explanation for the strategies that we're going to be going over today. The first one is we find that misinformation can do damage. So misinformation is false information that's spread by mistake, which I mentioned, and its intent is to mislead. We also believe that misinformation is sticky. The information continues to influence people's thinking even after they receive and they do accept a correction, and it tends to have this influential effect. Third, when able, we have to do what we can to teach students how to prevent misinformation from sticking. So because it's sticky, it's best to preempt it. And that can be achieved through explaining a manipulative argument strategy to the people. And then finally, Lewandowski and Christina Kelly and I argue for the importance of debunking often and properly. And so if somebody can't debunk or if somebody can't pre-bunk, then they need to debunk. And so for debunking to be effective, it's important to provide a detailed refutation.
Several media outlets, including NPR and Time Magazine, have deemed the Russian-Ukraine war as the war of misinformation. And this is a context that we'll be discussing our strategies in. In an unprecedented move, the Biden administration announced that 100,000 Russian soldiers were amassed on the border of Ukraine. Additionally, Great Britain warned its citizens of a potential coup and replacement of President Zelensky with a Kremlin-friendly leader. By revealing this sensitive intelligence, the US and its allies were making a clear message that Putin's lies and intentions prior to the release of fake news, as well as taking a risk by possibly revealing intelligence gathering tactics. So 2 things happened. We warned everybody, and then we were able to successfully bring together the world to unite against Putin's efforts. With the second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of the Ukraine in February, there has resulted in an increase in misleading claims about the war again on social media. It's in this context that we will explain our 3 media literacy strategies that will designed to help students tackle misinformation before, during, and after exposure. So first we'll talk about counterfactual evaluation. First of all, inoculation theory proposes leaders, writers, and scholars can attempt to immunize the public against disinformation or misinformation, similar to being inoculated against a virus, in the hopes of stopping the spread of fake news. Out of this theory, communication strategists have devised pre-bunking strategies that warn the public before false information is released. Some researchers argue that pre-bunking is actually more effective than debunking. Yet, I digress and say that more research really needs to be done to answer this debate. Today, we'll be addressing both of these techniques because it is difficult to know when the potential release of disinformation is going to happen, and because not all members of the public are going to receive the warning. Therefore, teaching students about both methods is imperative to foster media literacy skills. The debunking strategy I will be focusing on is counterfactual evaluation. Historically, counterfactual thinking or questioning has been used in history or political science courses to stimulate student thinking about the plausibility of different outcomes of past historical events. Students have often been prompted to consider, what if this event did or didn't happen? Bertolli and Catalini argue that this thought pattern is called counterfactual reflection versus counterfactual evaluation, since the students are analyzing past events. Instead, they propose that students engage in current events and messaging of disinformation to stimulate the evaluation of internal consistency in messages before students accept or reject the claim. This is how they will inoculate themselves. The researchers found that the participants with high conspiracy theory mentality are less likely to find fake news headlines plausible when using counterfactual evaluation. Thus, the premise of their experiment, I used the premise of their experiment to construct a short activity asking students to make counterfactual evaluations that we'll talk about on the next slide very briefly. So students were given about 5 to 8 Russian claims that I found on social media articles that were deemed false. The activity asked students to consider what if the claim was true. Considering these questions prompted students to evaluate the plausibility of the claim and engage their analytical thinking skills. Then, to go a step further in engaging their critical thinking skills, I also prompted students to take a second step and consider the motives behind the false claims, so as to further evaluate the validity of the claims. Students completed the exercise individually, and then we reviewed them as a group, some of the answers. On the next slide, let's review a few answers that students came up with. First of all, they clearly recognized that that Putin was trying to show the world and try to get Ukraine to lose sympathy and funding. They tried to make them look like war criminals. They also, students thought one of the implications could be that it started a world war. They considered also that Putin was trying to create mistrust with the Ukraine, build tension between people, and break up the alliance and create fear when sending these messages. Overall, I felt the activity was something that we could do quickly in the classroom. It stimulated their thinking, and they were really engaged talking about current events. I was very happy with the results. So now I'll turn it over to one of my great colleagues.
Thank you, Kelly. Okay, so let's dive into the second strategy for evaluating information, the SIFT method. So SIFT is a tool designed to help you determine the credibility and reliability of media shared online. So it's a quick and simple approach that can be applied to various types of online material, including social media posts, memes, statistics, videos, images, news articles, and other online content. SIFT was developed by Michael Caulfield as sort of a quick and effective selection of strategies tailored to navigating the complexities of our digital landscape. So moving beyond checklist evaluation approaches like the CRAP method that were frequently taught in the past. So rather than evaluating the article for relevance or whether it's a .com or .org or has advertisements, the SIFT method really just has us stop, take a moment to evaluate the source first, and then evaluate the claims. So the SIFT method is really useful for helping students identify false information, getting them into the habit of taking a moment to evaluate sources before reading or sharing something online. So the SIFT method consists of 4 key moves, and each sort of serves as an intermediate step in the fact-checking process. So you have stop, investigate the source, find trusted coverage, and trace claims, quotes, and media to the original context. And these moves can really be applied sequentially, and achieving success at any stage may indicate the completion of your fact-checking process. You might get to a certain point and you're like, yeah, this is definitely not something I want to use, and you're good. But let's take a little bit closer look at the moves. And I have some examples, something I might use with students in my library instruction sessions. Okay, so the first move, stop, serves as a reminder of sort of 2 critical aspects. So the first being before even starting to read a piece of content, you're going to want to pause, consider whether you know and trust the website or the information source. If you don't, then you're going to want to utilize these other moves to sort of gain some more insight before engaging further. And then the second sort of aspect of this is if you're already sort of engaged in the fact-checking process, if you're starting to feel overwhelmed, or you're kind of going down the rabbit hole of research, you're going to want to pause and sort of reassess your approach. And this will sort of ensure that your fact-checking efforts align with your intended purpose. So here's just one example to get us started. So in this case, I came across this damning report. French war correspondent unveils harrowing web of exploitation. Ukrainian refugees promise sanctuary fall prey to a trafficking nightmare, allegedly led by ex-ACF's Volkov. So before even taking the time to read this article that was linked in the tweet, I'm going to stop. And then I'm going to ask myself, do I know this source? So New York News Daily, it kind of sounds like maybe the New York Daily News, but no, I'm not familiar with this. So I'm going to move to the second move. So this is, again, investigate the source. So understanding the sort of origin and agenda of the source can really help influence your interpretation of the information that's being presented. And taking a moment, even if it's a brief moment, to identify the source can really help determine whether it's something you're comfortable trusting or sharing further. So again, you do this before even reading the content itself. So in this case, I did a quick Google search for the New York News Daily. It gave me enough information to determine that this is a problematic source. One of the few Google results that popped up was a recent New York Times article that mentions this site and a handful of other recent sites that have popped up being tied, having Russian ties. So very little else could be found about this organization. It really is just a WordPress blog, but kind of going along with it, I really couldn't find much else other than maybe like 3 months ago, the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine had stamped the appearance of it on the web. So there was very limited information about the source. So in this case, since we already identified that it's not a trusted source, I might just say, hey, I'm done. But, I am going to kind of continue on to the next step. So I might want to open up another tab and see if I can find some trusted coverage on this topic. And just as importantly, you want to scan multiple sources to get a clearer understanding if this is something that you understand, or if there's a consensus of viewpoints. And I always kind of let students know that, yeah, even credible sources can be less than perfect, but the information that's being shared there is going to be a lot more accurate and represented appropriately. And an important step is really for vetting these sources is taking the time to know how it's being reported in a number of publications to get a really nice sense of the topic. Okay. So in this case, like I said, I wasn't really able to find any other coverage of this story, just retweets. So I jumped into Newsbank, one of our library databases, and looked to see if I could find anything else. The only other story I could really find for this Adrian bouquet were 2 international publications, and I did a quick search of those, and they have been known to share inaccurate information as well. Even so, the articles that I did find had nothing to do with trafficking, nothing to do with the original story I'm kind of trying to find information about. There was a video about the individual from Press TV, but again, nothing to do with trafficking. And the Press TV is the same publication as one of the articles I found in Newsbank. So Caulfield encourages the use of Wikipedia as a really super quick fact-checking tool. And in this case, there were a number of cited controversies from Press TV, which is Iran's state-controlled television network. And the list was quite extensive. So they had publications relating to Holocaust denial and some issues with the coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So in this example, I was not able to find trusted coverage. And again, I could be done at this point, but I'm going to continue to the last step just for demonstration purposes. So the final move is to trace claims, quotes, and media to the original context. So maybe there's a picture, that has a caption and it's questionable. Perhaps you come across a video of people fighting. But what happened before that, the first part of the video clip, who started it, was anything else clipped out that may have been important for context, things like that. Perhaps you're looking at some medical treatment that was supposedly based on empirical research, but you're not really sure. All of these kind of things play into that idea of tracing it back to the original context. You want to see for yourself if the version you saw was accurately presented. So just very quickly, back to this example, I'm on the New York News daily page. Something that I encourage my students to do is a reverse image search. So this is just one little example of tracing something back to the original source. What I do is I right-click the image, search image with Google, and then you can kind of see where else the image has appeared on the web. In the case of this image, the earliest instance that I found was a 2012 Vietnamese website that was discussing the legalization of sex work based on a translation that I was able to pull up. But it was definitely nothing to do with Ukrainian refugees or sex trafficking. So this was just another red flag that sifting raised, and in terms of the credibility of the source. So the SIFT method really provides sort of a structured approach to evaluating information online, and it's helping to discern between credible content and misinformation through contextualization. And really, these moves can and should be developed into habits. And I think by offering opportunities for your students to practice these moves, you're really empowering them to engage with digital information more effectively.
So next, I am going to talk about strategy 3, which is debunking information. And this is important because halting the spread of misinformation sticks in a person's memory, even if the person knows the information is false. And associations can make people averse to actually believing the facts. So given this implication, students need to be reminded to verify the information before sharing it. So here's an example of how we'll use the debunking strategy to call out misinformation. To do that, what we'll do is use Lewandowski's debunking method, and then we're going to apply it to the tweet that you see on the screen. So a little bit about this tweet. One false claim that has been gaining traction on what was formerly known as Twitter and elsewhere. It suggested that the entire war between Russia and Ukraine is fake. And as evidence, some prominent right-wing accounts in the US have cited the supposed lack of footage from the front line. And a commentator complained that the lack of footage, about this lack of footage in a viral post, saying it smacks of a scam. There was a Twitter influencer with 1.4 million followers who claimed that there was no footage and no detailed updates of the war. The post was later shared by former US National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who added, "I double dare anyone to say he is wrong." However, as we know, the war in Ukraine has been well documented. So this slide is presenting Lewandowski's debunking method. The first thing we would teach students to do is to create a response that states the truth. What this means is that the students, or us, if we're using this method, should lead with our talking points, not somebody else's. So we would provide a factual alternative, and that's an alternative that fills a causal gap in explaining what happened if the misinformation is corrected. And that's an effective method of debunking. Myth is where you point out the misinformation. So you repeat the misinformation, and Lewandowski says you only do this once, and you do it directly prior to the correction. So one repetition of the myth is beneficial to belief updating for the receiver of the message. And then finally, you explain why the misinformation is wrong. So you juxtapose the correction with the mistaken misinformation. You want to do that to ensure that the rebuttal is paired with the misinformation. And then finally, we have fact. This is where we restate the fact again so that the fact is the last thing people process. So as you can see, this can work both in an online setting, but also if students were talking with a family member or friend who was verbally discussing misinformation, they'd be able to apply this in that context as well. So I want to show you how somebody could respond to this sort of tweet using the debunking strategy. So the first thing you would do is you would state the fact. The fact being, alongside eyewitness accounts, there's been ample footage from the Ukrainian front line filed by the BBC and other global broadcasters. So that's how the tweet would start. Then we would warn about the myth, and we would do that by saying, a myth is that the entire war in Ukraine has somehow been faked. Follow it up with an explanation of the fallacy. For that, we would say, this statement in the tweet is false because alongside eyewitness accounts, there's been ample footage from the Ukraine front line by the BBC and other global broadcasters who have also examined false narratives about some of the conflict's events. There's evidence from government agencies around the world that confirm the war is real. And then remember, Lewandowski says you end with a fact, the fact being the war in Ukraine is very real. So you can see where this would be a helpful tool when speaking with people on communicating online, because it gives you a chance to think about what you want to write. So we hope that by attending this presentation, you learned how people in higher education can play a role in preparing emerging citizens and how to learn these skills that are necessary for debunking disinformation along with fake news. And we discussed the 3 strategies, and now we'd like to open it up for questions.
At this current time, if you'd like to come off mute or come by on your camera so you can ask questions of Angela, Christina, and Kelly, please do so. And we will also be monitoring the chat for you.
And once again, I did share a link with the resources and our references in the chat. And then if you refer to the slides later, the QR code works too.
Dave says, thank you. I suspect that SIFT will work best for my classes.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yes, I have a quick question. Would any of the commentators want to try and do this live with their students in a classroom with everyone having access, for example, to a cell phone or a computer? Is that something they would recommend, to do it live together as a group?
Yeah, I actually did this as part of a workshop that a student and I co-ran, and we found having students do the activity during the workshop was really helpful. You just want to give yourself enough time so that students can quick do a search. And you also would want to make sure that you tell them what topic to do, and then you have a sense of what's out there so that you do have some ideas of what they may share and then how you would respond.
Yeah, I kind of approach it similarly. I think they learn best when they're actually trying it for themselves. So we'll kind of go over, for at least the SIFT method, the 4 moves. And then I usually, depending on the content of the course or the, who I'm working with, I will adjust the examples that I'm having them kind of evaluate. And it can be a variety of things. It could be tweets, it could be blogs, websites, and then they kind of go through in a group, and then I have them share what they found together with the whole class, and that tends to work really well.
The other thing I would suggest is just having a few backup examples in your back pocket, because sometimes I find it can be a little bit difficult to find the disinformation because we're getting better and better at scrubbing it from the internet. So always good to have a few backups, but I do agree that would be much more engaging for students.
And then if there's any other questions, feel free. Angela, do you want to pull up our contact info? Any of us are more than happy to continue the conversation, so please reach out. I should have done this before, but I'll probably share an example of sort of a lesson plan for this that I typically use in the library classroom, and I'll add it to that resources list later this afternoon. But if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us.
We've got a question in the chat from Rihanna, wondering how you've adapted these strategies for current events or to interrogate disinfo that has been reposted, reprinted in major publications, thinking of the New York Times recent issues.
I'll jump in there just quickly. I mean, yeah, that's a huge concern. And I think that's why when I am talking to students, I always encourage them to look at a variety of publications. So I know there's increasing distrust, and this kind of incident definitely doesn't help, but just encouraging them to look for additional sources if they have any concerns, or if any other red flags have been raised through the sifting method. Yeah, I don't know if Angela or Kelly, you want to add anything to that?
I could see Kelly's strategy working well to address that.
Yeah, and I also have students from time to time, like I had them use the Khashoggi death, and I split them up in groups and gave them 3 different media sources from left to right, and had them then go investigate what are they saying when the controversy was going on as to who might be responsible for the death. And there were very different narratives, and it gave them an idea to at least see that there are multiple narratives, and then really looking at those media sources that are unbiased in the middle and how they were reporting things is another way to kind of look at it from when we're looking at major media sources as well, if you're looking at kind of the bias prism.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for your time. We really appreciate it.